I'm Stacey Marie Ishmael, managing editor of crypto for Bloomberg News. And this is Bloomberg Crypto, a daily Bloomberg iHeart podcast. It's Monday, August 22nd. It can feel like we hear and say the words crypto and regulation mentioned in the same sentence a lot these days. That's because there are multiple pieces of proposed crypto legislation making their way through the US political machine right now. Representative Maxine Waters, who's the chair of the powerful House Financial Services Committee, and ranking member Patrick McHenry want to regulate stablecoins. Senators Cynthia Lummis and Kirsten Gillibrand have proposed several significant changes to the crypto regulation regime in a bill that they're calling the Responsible Financial Innovation Act. And earlier this year, President Joe Biden himself issued his executive order on ensuring responsible development of digital assets, which basically mandated every relevant federal agency to figure out, or at least define, their position on crypto. And of course, to identify ways to protect consumer rights as well as the rights of investors. Joining me today for a discussion of these many complicated pieces of potential crypto legislation in the US is Nathan Dean, a senior analyst at Bloomberg Intelligence.
Very few times in my career have I ever heard that an industry wants more regulation, but that is something that the crypto industry wants.
Nathan, thank you so much for joining us today. It seems like there's a lot happening in Washington, D.C. as it relates to crypto and regulations right now.
Yeah, actually, 2022 is the year of the crypto industry providing a lot of education and a lot of information to policymakers and regulators on what they should do in 2023. It's a story of regulatory clarity. If you come from the SEC's perspective, well, there's a lot of clarity out there. 95% of the tokens out there at the moment are considered securities. This is SEC Chairman Gary Gensler.
Many of these tokens have the attributes of securities. They're raising money from the public, and the public is anticipating profits based upon the efforts of others.
On the other side, from the industry's point of view, you have a new digital asset class. This is something that 1933 era securities law does not work for, and neither side is willing to acquiesce to the other. So what happens? We're in this stalemate. And what the industry is doing right now is they're essentially waiting for one of two things. One, for the SEC to start cracking down via enforcement actions, and the SEC has sort of done some of that. Or two, and this is the industry's more preferred solution, is that they move forward with congressional legislation. Now, we've seen several key pieces of legislation coming out over the last few weeks, whether it's stablecoins, a comprehensive bill that came from Senators Lummis and Gillibrand. Most recently, we have a bipartisan bill that comes from the Senate Ag Committee. None of this legislation is going to pass this year, but what they are doing is they are actually setting the stage for legislation to pass in 2023.
And it sounds like, in 2023, as you say, we're going to see a lot of all of these efforts pay off. So what's happening right now, in your role on Bloomberg Intelligence, you analyze these things that are coming through. One of the big things recently was the Biden White House executive order that essentially directed various of the federal agencies to figure out their crypto strategy. What have been some of the things coming out of that you expect to bear fruit in that 2023 timeline?
Okay, so, going back to the earlier part of this year in March, President Biden put out an executive order, and that executive order essentially directed agencies under his direction, so this is like Treasury, Homeland Security, and so forth like that, to go forth and come back with reports and recommendations on what they should do moving forward. Those reports and recommendations should be out between now and, say, the end of October. So that's one thing that's been happening. Now, the second thing that's been happening is the SEC and the CFTC, and even a little bit to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and the Fed, have been doing a lot of their own analysis on the crypto industry and looking at risks. Now, this is where it differs a little bit. The Securities and Exchange Commission, they view anything out there, 95% of the tokens out there as securities. For purposes, essentially Bitcoin and to a certain extent, Ether are considered commodities. Now, that's something the legislation will address, and I'll get there in a second. But for right now, 95% of the tokens in the SEC's mind are securities. Now, the CFTC doesn't really have much authority over crypto at the moment, other than, Bitcoin futures, anything, that's over at the CME or at the Intercontinental Exchange. But then you have the Federal Reserve looking at stable coins. And so there's all these different pieces of the puzzle that's been going on, and the industry just doesn't know how to react to it. It's actually very frustrating, I think, for the industry to be able to prepare. How do I actually go forth and grow my company and grow as an industry when I don't know what the rules are? I don't know if the SEC is going to come down and give me an enforcement action next year. Now, what this legislation most likely will do is it will actually give regulatory clarity to the crypto industry. And now the Senate Agricultural Committee has released a bipartisan bill that would essentially, this is called the Digital Commodities Consumer Protection Act of 2022. But this bill would actually give CFTC, the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, authority over cash markets, spot markets. It would also give them authority over what is deemed to be digital commodities. This would be a new asset class. Now, the securities would still remain. So the debate over whether a token is a security or a commodity, that would still remain. But what the industry is most looking for, and what the industry is most likely going to get, and this is Coinbase, FTX, Binance, whoever registers as a crypto exchange, is, regulatory certainty in terms of avoiding enforcement actions.
I want to ask you something there before we get into the enforcement actions, which is there, in your observation, kind of what you're hearing, is there a preference for who people want to be regulated by? And is that related to the potential severity of those enforcement actions?
Absolutely. Very few times in my career have I ever heard that an industry wants more regulation, but that is something that the crypto industry wants. And they want to be regulated by the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. The reason being is the CFTC has what is known as principles-based regulation. Over at the SEC, it's prescriptive-based. So if I'm at the Commodity Futures Trading Commission and I'm FTX or Coinbase, I can create my own rule book. I can create my own rules. I can create my own governance procedures. And as long as they meet the principle of the regulation, the CFTC says you're good. If you're over on the SEC side, well, then it gets a little bit more in-depth and granular and in the weeds, and each group would have to create their own system and have to make sure that all the I's are dotted and all the T's are crossed and so forth. So, the industry certainly wants to go to the CFTC, and that education and that information that they've been providing to lawmakers in 2022 is paying off, because you're seeing this both from Democrats and Republicans.
In the sense that they too, the Democrats and the Republicans, are also starting to lean towards having the CFTC be the main crypto regulator.
Correct. Crypto is funny because it's not really a bipartisan issue. It's more of a generational issue. And what that means is that you have Democrats who are very much okay with the idea of the crypto industry going to the CFTC. You have Republicans who are okay with it. And then you have Democrats and Republicans who are against that. Now, the big issue for, let's just say giving the CFTC oversight over the crypto industry is that, it allows the crypto firms to essentially go to a new regulatory framework and avoid threats of enforcement actions, because SEC Chairman Gary Gensler has said consistently that, current regulation applies. We don't need new rules. We don't need new legislation. All firms need to do is come in and register. Come in and talk to us, come in to register.
We at the SEC are going to do what we can. But right now, there's far too many of these platforms that haven't come in to basically comply with the law and register.
He says this almost every interview he says, but nobody has really done that. And the reason being is, and I have a Star Wars joke here, is that it's like, the Return of the Jedi. It's this Admiral Akbar, the big squid creature who leads the Rebel Alliance. Yeah. He screams, it's a trap. Well, if you go talk to the SEC, it could be a trap, because the SEC would then take a look and say, okay, this is great. Thank you very much for coming in and talking to us. But for the last 2 years, you've been operating outside of securities law, and therefore you need to, pay for that. So if this legislation passes next year, not only does the industry get clarity, but they almost get I don't want to call it a get out of jail free card, but they get away from that threat of the SEC enforcement.
Which is, of course, what the industry would have everyone believe, right? That the main thing here is clarity, as opposed to being subject to what they perceive as more onerous rules and regulations.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the 1933 Securities Act, I mean, it's only about 40 pages. I mean, it's very light. And so it's very broad. And, the SEC has taken the approach that these firms just need to come in and register. And if you go in and register and start from the beginning, let's just say there's a new company and you want to follow the SEC standard, and you go in and register, well, then you go in and you produce all this different types of governance and these rule books and these, the technology requirements and compliance and examination and so forth, and it costs a lot of money. Now, you do that at the same time that others in the industry aren't registering with the SEC. And so now you're spending a lot more money when the retail customer, don't really care about things like governance and, like the behind the scenes operational aspects, if you will. So, the industry really hasn't made any decision, or the industry has really taken the point of, let's not register until we have to. And instead, let's lobby Congress to try and give us a regulatory framework that we can work with. And ultimately, I think that's going to pay off. Now, the SEC is not done yet, though, because like I said before, I do anticipate legislation moving next year, but what type of legislation? Because there was a bill that came out earlier this year from Senators Loomis and Gillibrand, and this was the first comprehensive bill. And the question here is stablecoins, because if you look at the lobbying that has been done to Congress this year, stablecoins has become a bigger issue than just the crypto industry writ large. Seeing a stablecoin fail is something that goes into the news cycle, and that's something a politician can understand. It's a little bit easier for them than understanding what, registration requirements for the Commodity Futures Trading Commission can be. And so, certain folks up on Capitol Hill have taken the approach of, well, let's do stablecoins first, and then let's do the rest later. And in fact, the House Financial Services Committee, this is Chairwoman Maxine Waters and Ranking Member McHenry from North Carolina, they're going to have a stablecoin bill that comes out in September. So, there's going to be momentum to try and get stablecoin legislation done before the crypto exchange registration issue. And now the question is, well, what do we do and when? Do we do stablecoins? Do we do commodity and futures? Do we do spot markets? And that eats up a lot of political capital. But the order is the question, is do they move on stablecoins first? The House Financial Services Committee versus the Senate Agricultural Committee. I mean, who has the ability to move their legislation first? Do they move them at the same time? Do they move them differently? So that's where it's just going to get a little bit messy. But ultimately, with this legislation passing, probably by a year from now.
Up next, more of my conversation with Nathan Dean of Bloomberg Intelligence. We'll discuss more of the regulatory conundrum facing federal agencies trying to balance the interests of consumers, investors, and digital asset companies. I want to go back to the conversation about stablecoins, because as you said, there's lots of reasons why it's getting so much attention, but there's one I want us to call out, which is, various regulators around the world have identified two things about stablecoins that stress them out. One, the possibility of the global transmission of risk, right? Because you have people in lots of different countries using these very liquid, supposedly stable assets. And, as you mentioned, consumers can get burned by these. And when they collapse, it's a news cycle. And that is always politically fraught. But the second thing is some governments perceive them as competitive to their own sovereign currencies. And I'm wondering if there's anything about the current focus on stablecoins or any other elements that you're getting from this proposed regulation that has a sense of a national security consideration?
That's a great question. And in fact, there's two aspects to the way that I would answer that. The first is specifically when it comes to stable coins, the legislation that's coming out from the House Financial Services Committee is more essentially just going to require both banks and non-banks who issue stable coins to be backed up 100% by high quality liquid assets. It really doesn't get into the national security argument all that much. So view that more of as a tactical bill. And that's the one that we anticipate that's going to come out next year. The more strategic national risk aspect, though, comes from the Federal Reserve in this creation of a central bank digital currency. Now, I don't think it was really well reported at the time, but when President Biden put out the executive order in March, There was a directive in that executive order to direct the Department of Treasury to come back with a report on whether or not central bank digital currency is advisable. And if so, it directed the Attorney General to create legislative language doing that. Congress will ignore it, but that's much further step than I anticipated that the Biden administration would take. Now, if you go to the Fed and you ask Jerome Powell, you ask Governor Brainerd on whether or not the Fed will create a central bank digital currency, Chairman Powell has said that he would only do so if he was directed by Congress or the executive branch. Now, Congress really tried to hammer him down on whether or not he would do it without a congressional action. But Governor Brainerd has been open to the idea of a central bank digital currency with the caveat that it would take up to 5 years. And the reason why I think the Fed will eventually approve a central bank digital currency is just because of the argument that if the United States doesn't, others will. The United States needs to do one before other countries end up getting the amount of liquidity that goes to the point where the U.S. is harmed by that. Generally, when the crypto industry comes to Washington, they say, well, if you don't do this, we're going to fall behind. The argument that the United States needs to create a central bank digital currency before others create liquidity to the point where it begins to harm U.S. interests, that is actually working a little bit over at the Fed with the caveat that this could take up to 5 years.
And just on that note about, things that you think folks might not be fully paying attention to or things that have been underreported, is there any other element of either this regulation or the kind of, the conversations and the discussions that you might be having or are privy to that you think people really need to be paying much more attention to than they potentially are right now?
So I wouldn't underestimate SEC Chairman Gary Gensler. We've said that this legislation we think will pass next year, or some form of this legislation will pass next year. But, the SEC chairman is taking the approach that 95% of these tokens out there are securities. And as a result, the crypto exchanges that are offering these securities aren't following securities law. And therefore, we are just waiting for enforcement actions to occur. In fact, we've even seen statements from him over the last few weeks that just go as far as to say that maybe the SEC should get into the business of writing a rulemaking on how crypto exchanges can operate. So, that's the question of, okay, this legislation will pass, but, there are several Democrats and Republicans out there who are not comfortable with this. And ultimately, President Biden has to sign it. And, I don't think anybody really knows what President Biden's view on cryptocurrency is. But there are going to be several catalyst moments between now and, say, August of next year that are going to make things a little bit more challenging for the crypto industry. But ultimately, we think if you were to say 3-5 years from now, do you have this regulatory clarity? You do. And most of the times when we've seen a new regulation, and I'm not talking about crypto here, but just whenever you see a new form of financial regulation come in that disrupts markets, it ultimately benefits the bigger players that have compliance teams, technology teams, and so forth, to the detriment of the mom and pops out there.
Nathan, thank you so much. That has been such a helpful and I think insightful overview of what folks can or should be expecting as it relates to U.S. crypto regulation. Really appreciate you taking the time to come on the podcast today.
No, thank you very much for having me. It was an absolute joy.
You can find more of Nathan Dean's analysis on the Bloomberg terminal or follow him on Twitter at NathanDeanDC. On the next Bloomberg Crypto, London is one of the world's top destinations for banks and financial services firms, but it's had a harder time attracting and keeping crypto companies because of regulatory uncertainty around the status of digital assets. Tomorrow, my colleague Emily Nicole will tackle how the Law Commission of England and Wales is working to rebuild that reputation for regulatory innovation. This is Bloomberg Crypto, a daily podcast from Bloomberg and iHeartRadio. For more shows from iHeartRadio, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. Send us your comments, questions, or suggestions for the show to crypto@bloomberg.net. Or find us on Twitter, we're @crypto. The supervising producer of Bloomberg Crypto is Vicky Vergolina. Our senior producer is Janet Babin. Our producer is Sharon Barrero. Associate producer is Ty Butler. Desta Wonderad is our engineer. Original music by Leo Sidran. I'm Stacey Marie Ishmael. We'll be back tomorrow.